Hi, my name's Tracy, and I want to talk about two types of ME/CFS. I want to start off by saying that while the following is based on really extensive reading of research articles and a lot of reading of personal accounts of people with ME, it's obviously not the final word on the subject. And I'm doing this not to say who has ME and who doesn't have ME, but just to try to improve outcomes for everybody. Well, my basic message is I believe that people with ME suffer from at least two different conditions. That is, some people suffer from one, some suffer from another. But we have lumped ourselves together based on overly general commonalities in symptoms. Let me give you an example. Sleep disturbances are supposed to be a, a requirement for having ME/CFS. Well, what is a sleep disturbance? I have restless legs. You might have insomnia. Someone else might have sleep apnea. They're all sleep disturbances. They all count for qualifying to say you have ME/CFS, but they clearly spring from different processes. So, given this lumping together of at least two different conditions, research and treatment have suffered as a result. Ideally, we would know enough to group people by the processes behind their symptoms rather than this vague and actually incomplete list of symptoms that's used to diagnose us. So when I say two types of ME/CFS, I mean people with ME/CFS have one of two separate diseases or more. Both of these involve, at the very least, debilitating fatigue after overexertion. That's basically why we end up being lumped together. And then other symptoms that might vary even within a particular type and definitely vary between the two types. So I believe that these two major types of ME/CFS are what I'm calling type A, which is based in a problem in the autonomic nervous system, essentially that the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight part of it, is on a hair trigger. And people with type A typically have no sudden acute onset of the disease, but it's definitely not attributable to a specific infection or some bodily trauma that would activate an immune response. And very importantly, there's no delay between overexerting oneself and getting PEM or worse symptoms. And finally, any immune problem might exist, might be part of it, but is secondary, springs from the problem with the autonomic nervous system. Type B is based in the nervous system, but especially in the immune system. And people with type B have a sudden acute onset after an infection, usually, maybe some bodily trauma that activates an immune response. And a really important difference in symptoms is that there's a significant delay between physical overexertion and worse symptoms, that is, PEM. So I believe that it's very important that it takes, for example, a couple of days for me to feel PEM after overexerting myself, and other people feel it right away. It seems like there's a considerably different process going on there. And finally, I believe that the immune dysfunction and immune problem is at the beginning of it and is basic to it, to type B. And, there are actually there are certainly other probably less frequently suffered versions of what's called ME/CFS. We know that some people who have craniocervical instability are also called people with ME/CFS. And this is something that can be identified. It has a name, and there's actually a surgical treatment for it. And probably there are other causes too. When the NIH did its in-depth study of a few people with ME/CFS, first people had to go through an hour-long screening, which I underwent, and I made it all the way through, but they wouldn't accept left-handers because their MRI machine was set up only for right-handers. But had I gone in, it's possible that they would have then screened me physically and found me to not actually have ME/CFS as they understand it, because they excluded, if I remember correctly, the majority of people who came in because they found that they had other problems. So we have two or more diseases, but they're lumped together under one name. And for sure, all the different types deserve more attention from researchers and from medical providers than they're getting now. The problem with having them lumped together, one of the problems, is that research is less clear, because if the studies don't distinguish between different diseases, it's going to muddy their results. Partly this happens because the criteria that are used to admit people into research studies aren't very specific sometimes. The Fukuda criteria, for example, are really general. But even when the criteria are relatively specific, they're still vague enough for people with ME or for researchers to convince themselves that, well, that's not exactly what it says in the list, but it's close enough. It's in the ballpark. And I have seen this personally in action as a research participant. Another problem is that if someone hears that a treatment is effective for a lot of people with ME/CFS, they won't know whether it is effective for their type. So someone suffering from type A might try something that's only effective for people with type B. Of course, there will be some types of treatment that are effective for both, but there will be plenty that are not, and that should be clearer. So my suggestion for what to do is, first of all, to rename the types so that they're clearly different. Some people for a long time have wanted to name type A chronic fatigue syndrome and type B myalgic encephalomyelitis. I don't have a position on that. I just want there to be clearly different names. Secondly, and more importantly, researchers should do one of two things to keep them separated. Number one, they could always register the type of onset, the type of PEM, whether it's delayed or not, the immune status, are people immunocompromised or not, and doing that while including everyone, they can see when types A and B overlap, and that would help everyone. Another approach is to just look at one type at a time and be clear about this. So currently, this approach is undertaken most often for type B, where researchers require a sudden infectious onset. However, it's still possible that someone with type A, an autonomic nervous system problem, remembers having an infection around the time that they got worse and says, yes, I had an infectious onset. So it would be better if researchers would look for example, to the delay in PEM after exercise, other immune problems, to be sure that they've got a clear cohort of type A or type B, whichever it is. Well, I was going to go into more about type A and type B and treatments and things like that, but clearly this has already taken too long. So that'll be in future videos. And more diatribes are coming about how to adopt a more systematic approach to research on ME/CFS, because this is sorely lacking. Thank you.